The silence was the first weapon. It arrived without warning, a perfect, chilling absence of sound where there should have been the roar of engines tearing through the upper atmosphere. One moment the sky was an ordinary canvas of blue and white. The next, it was occupied. They called them the apparitions, for they had appeared as if from nowhere. Great, obsidian needles hanging motionless in the sky above every city with a population of over 1 million. There was no heat signature, no energy reading, no gravitational distortion. They were simply there, colossal, silent, and utterly indifferent. They absorbed radar, lidar, and light itself, creating voids in the sky that the eye struggled to comprehend, like holes punched through the very fabric of reality. The world didn't scream, it held its breath. For the first week, humanity was a child in the dark, frozen in place, listening for the monster it knew was there. Stock markets plunged not with a crash, but in a sickening, silent slide. Airports closed, highways emptied, and the ceaseless hum of global commerce faded into a whisper. People stayed home, watching the unmoving black shapes on their screens, their faces lit by the pale glow of a world waiting for a verdict. The apparitions did nothing. They broadcast no message, launched no fighters, fired no beams of light. They just hung there, their presence a psychological toxin seeping into the collective consciousness of mankind. They were a constant, suffocating reminder of our own insignificance. And under that silent pressure, the carefully constructed edifice of human civilization began to crack. This was the exact scenario Dr. Elias Vance had spent the last 20 years of his life predicting, a prophecy that had cost him his tenure, his reputation, and his family. He wasn't a doomsayer who preached of fire and brimstone. His warnings were colder, more academic, and in the end, far more terrifying. While his colleagues at SETI aimed their dishes at the stars, listening for greetings, Elias had focused on the gaps, the silences in the cosmic noise. He'd found a pattern, a faint, repeating signal that was too structured to be natural, yet too complex to be a simple beacon. He called it the archive, a vast, passive cataloging system that periodically swept this sector of the galaxy. He argued it wasn't a prelude to contact, but to collection. You don't talk to the ants you're about to put in a jar. You simply observe them, record their behavior, and then take the entire colony. Now, living in a cluttered apartment above a disused bookstore in Chicago, watching the unmoving shape of an apparition eclipse the top of the Willis Tower, he felt no vindication, only a deep, hollow dread. The phone call he had been waiting for his entire adult life came on the 8th day of the silence. The voice on the other end was clipped, military, and devoid of apology. A black sedan with tinted windows collected him an hour later. He was brought to a subterranean facility beneath the plains of Nebraska, a place that didn't officially exist, codenamed the Crucible. It was a nexus of the world's remaining power structures. Generals from the U.S., China, and Russia sat at the same table as intelligence chiefs from MI6 and Mossad, their old rivalries rendered meaningless. The person who greeted him was General Catherine Railing, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved from granite, her eyes holding the weariness of someone who hadn't slept in a week, but whose mind was still ruthlessly sharp. "Dr. Vance," she said, her voice a low gravel. "We've read your files, the ones we publicly ridiculed and buried. The archive. Passive observation as a precursor to subjugation. Yet right now, your insane theories are the only thing that remotely explains this. So, talk." For the next 18 hours, Elias talked. He explained his theory. The apparitions weren't warships. They were scanners of an unimaginable complexity. They weren't here to fight us in a conventional sense. They were dissecting us from a distance, mapping our neural pathways, our languages, our histories, our emotions, our art, our every secret. They were learning everything that made us human before they decided what to do with us. "You can't shoot them," Elias concluded, his voice raw. "Trying to launch a nuke at one of those things would be like a caveman throwing a rock at the moon. The weapon isn't the ship. The weapon is the knowledge they are gathering. They will learn our weaknesses, our fears, our breaking points, and they will use them against us to dismantle our society without firing a single shot. In fact, they've already started." The generals and spies listened, their skepticism warring with the stark, silent reality hanging in the skies above them. They wanted a target, a frequency to jam, a vulnerability to exploit. Elias was telling them their enemy was an idea, a process of learning. "So, what do you propose, Doctor?" asked a Russian general, his voice thick with impatience. "That we teach them nothing. We hide in caves." Elias shook his head, a flicker of something wild in his eyes. "No, if they're reading our story, we have to change the ending. We can't give them a logical response. Logic is what they expect. Data, patterns, predictable reactions to fear, that's what they're consuming. We have to give them something that breaks the rules of logic, something they can't process, something that would be an error in their archive." He called it a cognitive singularity, a concept so uniquely, chaotically, and paradoxically human that it would be indigestible to a purely data-driven intelligence. He didn't know what it was yet, but he knew where to look, not in weapon schematics or advanced physics, but in the messy, irrational, and often self-destructive annals of human experience. He was given a small team, a cynical computational linguist named Ben Carter, who thought Elias was a charlatan, and a brilliant but overwhelmed astrophysicist, Dr. Lena Petrova, who was terrified enough to believe him. For weeks, they worked in a frantic race against the slow-motion collapse of the world. Above ground, riots had begun, not out of anger, but out of a creeping, nihilistic despair. Cults sprang up, worshiping the silent visitors as gods or demons. Suicide rates skyrocketed. The apparitions remained silent, their work nearly complete. Elias and his team dove into the depths of the human condition. They analyzed the neural patterns of artists lost in creative frenzy, the illogical chemical surge of a mother's love for her child, the paradoxical nature of faith. They fed their findings into quantum computers, searching for an anomaly, a piece of the human puzzle that didn't fit with the rest. Ben Carter, the linguist, argued for a logical paradox, a self-referential statement that could trap an AI in a loop. Like, "This sentence is false," Elias countered. "That's a parlor trick. These beings catalog entire galaxies. They've seen every parlor trick." Lena Petrova suggested transmitting complex mathematical constants like pi or the golden ratio, universal truths. "They already know them," Elias insisted. "They're looking for what makes us unique, not what makes the universe predictable." He kept coming back to one singular concept, an idea that seemed to defy all evolutionary and logical imperative sacrifice. Not the tactical sacrifice of a soldier for his unit that was a calculated risk. He meant true, selfless, often pointless sacrifice. The stranger who jumps onto subway tracks to save a fallen child, knowing they will both likely die. The parent who gives their last ration of food to their son or daughter, smiling as they starve. The firefighter who runs into a collapsing building for a dog. It was illogical. It was inefficient. It was a bug in the code of survival. It was perfectly, beautifully, and tragically human. They're a collector species, Elias explained to a skeptical General Railing, his face gaunt from sleepless nights. They value data, preservation, the continuation of a species record, the idea of willingly, consciously, and lovingly destroying the self for another, with no guarantee of success or reciprocation. It won't compute. It's not just a zero in their equation, it's a value that breaks the equation itself. Railing was unconvinced. So, you want to? What broadcast stories about heroes at them? Elias shook his head. No, not stories. The raw data. We have to show them, not tell them. His plan was audacious and macabre. He proposed using the Crucible's global broadcast override system, a doomsday tool designed to deliver presidential orders to every screen and speaker on Earth to transmit a single, focused stream of information directly at the apparitions. He wanted to broadcast the raw, unfiltered biometric and neurological data of a human being engaged in an act of ultimate sacrifice. The problem was they didn't have a willing subject. The project was on the verge of being scrapped. The Joint Chiefs were already discussing a last-ditch, suicidal nuclear assault, an act of pure desperation. They had given Elias Vance his chance, and in their eyes, he had failed. That night, as Elias sat alone in his sterile quarters, a message appeared on his terminal. It was from Lena Petrova. It was a single file, a scan of her own complete neurological and biometric profile. Attached was a note. My brother was a firefighter. He died on 9/11 running back into the North Tower after it had already started to fall. He was trying to find a woman's cat. I never understood it. It seemed so pointless. But maybe it's the whole point. Don't let this be for nothing. Elias. Before he could react, alarms blared through the Crucible. On the main view screen, the image of the apparition above Chicago shimmered. The air around it was beginning to distort, to ionize, a low, resonant hum. The first sound they had ever made began to vibrate through the bunker's concrete shell. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was the sound of a machine finishing its final calculation. The scan was almost complete. General Railing's voice cut through the noise. It's over, Doctor. We're out of time. I'm pulling the plug on your project. But Elias was already moving. He grabbed Lena's data file, sprinting through the corridors toward the broadcast control center. Ben Carter surprisingly at his side, clearing a path. You're insane. You know that, Ben shouted over the alarms. Completely, Elias yelled back, a desperate, wild grin on his face. They sealed the doors behind them. On the console, a single button would route the broadcast. He would have one chance, one shot to upload this cognitive singularity, this digital ghost of a woman's love for her pointless, heroic brother, and aim it at the silent gods in the sky. He placed his hand over the console, the hum of the apparitions vibrating in his bones. He had no idea if he was about to save the world or sign its death warrant by showing the collectors the one thing they had come all this way to find. He took a deep breath and pressed the button. The moment the broadcast initiated, the universe held its breath. There was no flash of light, no thunderous boom. The data, the ghost of Lena Petrova's love and loss, the raw telemetry of a soul defined by another sacrifice streamed from the Crucible's transmitters as a silent, invisible spear of information aimed at the heart of the Chicago apparition. In the broadcast control room, the only sound was the frantic pounding on the reinforced steel door and the ragged breathing of Elias and Ben. Open this door, Vance. That's a direct order. General Railing's voice, found distorted by the intercom, was a serrated edge of fury. Elias ignored her. his eyes glued to the sensor readings on the main screen. For a full 30 seconds, nothing happened. The apparitions remained inert. The low hum continued its steady, ominous thrum. The dread in the room was thick enough to choke on. The thought, cold and sharp, pierced Elias's mind. It didn't work. I've done nothing. I've only wasted our last precious seconds. He saw the folly of his grand theory, the arrogance of believing he could reason with a god, or that a single, fleeting human emotion could matter to a being that consumed stars. Ben Carter, slumped against a server rack, just stared at him, his usual cynicism replaced by a look of profound, hollow pity. Then, it began. It started not with a bang, but with a discordant note, the perfect, resonant hum that had vibrated in the bones of every human on the planet for weeks suddenly soured, like a string snapping on a cello. The single note fractured into 1,000 shrieking, chaotic frequencies. It was the sound of a perfect machine being fed an impossible problem, its logic circuits screaming in protest. On the view screen, the obsidian surface of the Chicago apparition began to shimmer violently, its flawless absorption of light failing as waves of iridescent, oily color washed across its hull. The other apparitions across the globe followed suit, their silent vigil shattered by a cacophony of digital noise and visual corruption. They were glitching. The perfect Isololent collectors were experiencing an error. The pounding on the door stopped. Elias could imagine the scene in the command center generals and analysts frozen, staring at their own screens as the silent gods in their skies began to twitch and shudder like dying animals. A new wave of panic was erupting across the planet, but it was different this time. The first was a cold, creeping fear of the unknown. This was a hot, sharp terror of a known power coming undone. What happens when a thing of such immense scale and composure loses its mind? Does it simply shut down, or does it lash out in its death throes? Elias's hands flew across his console, bringing up global psychic telemetry feeds, experimental sensors designed to measure mass emotional states. The graphs were a chaotic storm, but something was wrong. The primary emotion wasn't just fear. There was confusion, yes, but also a strange, pervasive melancholy, a shared, inexplicable sense of loss. Then the first reports trickled in. A truck driver in Des Moines, pulling over on the interstate, weeping because he suddenly felt the ghost of a memory, the smell of smoke, the weight of an oxygen tank, and an overwhelming love for a brother he'd never had. A stockbroker in Tokyo, collapsing in her office, overwhelmed by the sudden, vivid sensation of running toward a collapsing building instead of away from it. A mother in Lagos, holding her child, suddenly understanding with absolute clarity the concept of giving her life for a stranger's lost pet. It was Lena's ghost. The apparitions, unable to parse the data of her sacrifice, were not deleting it. They were reflecting it, casting the raw, emotional, and sensory fragments of her memory back at the planet in a chaotic, psychic wave. "My God, Elias," Ben whispered, his face pale. "What did you do?" Elias stared at the telemetry, a dawning horror and wonder on his face. "I thought I was giving them a logic bomb," he said, his voice barely audible. "But it's not a bomb. It's a virus of empathy, and we're all catching it." General Rayling's voice came over the intercom again, but her fury was gone, replaced by a tense, bewildered calm. "Vance, report. What is happening?" Elias took a shaky breath. "They can't process it. General, the concept of illogical, selfless sacrifice. It's an error in their system, a paradox they can't resolve. To try and understand it, they're running a simulation using the raw data I sent, but their processors are so powerful, the simulation is leaking. They're broadcasting the very thing that's breaking them. The implications were staggering. Elias hadn't just attacked their hardware, he had hacked their consciousness, if such a term applied. He had infected a race of pure, cold intelligence with the most irrational and powerful of human experiences. For 2 days, the world was caught in this psychic storm. The apparitions flickered and shrieked in their orbital positions, and humanity below shared in their madness, experiencing the collective dream of Lena Petrova's final, defining moments. Societies teetered on the brink. How could you run a government, a military, a society, when a significant portion of your population was randomly crippled by a ghost's grief and love? The crucible was in chaos, but Elias held them back from any rash action. "Wait," he insisted. "Look." He pointed to the feed from Chicago. While the other apparitions continued their chaotic glitching, the one that had received the initial broadcast was changing. Its dissonant shrieking was coalescing, modulating into something that was not quite music, but a complex and mournful melody. The violent, oily shimmers on its surface subsided, replaced by a soft, internal luminescence, a faint blue light that pulsed in time with the strange new song. "It's learning," Lena Petrova's voice said. Elias and Ben spun around. She was standing at a secondary console they hadn't noticed, her face drawn, but her eyes blazing with an intensity that silenced the room. Railing must have let her in. "The others are rejecting the data, trying to purge it," she continued, pointing to the screens. "But the Chicago vessel, it's integrating it. It's trying to build a model to understand the why behind my brother's choice." As she spoke, the blue light within the Chicago apparition intensified, and then it projected something. Not a beam of energy, not a weapon, but an image. A colossal, three-dimensional construct of light formed in the air beneath the ship, visible to the entire city. It was a shape of impossible complexity, a fractal that constantly folded in on itself. At its core was the shape of a human figure, indistinct and shimmering. Another figure, smaller, was trapped in a collapsing part of the fractal. The larger figure was reaching for the smaller one, but the act of reaching caused its own form to destabilize, to break apart and feed the beautiful, deadly chaos of the pattern. It was a mathematical representation of sacrifice, a perfect, cold, and utterly beautiful equation for a broken heart. It was the apparition's attempt to translate love into logic, and the result was a question mark the size of a skyscraper hanging in the sky. The world watched, mesmerized. The psychic storm abated, the focus of the entire alien network now seemingly on the single apparition above Chicago and its silent, luminous question. For the first time, this was not an act of observation or aggression. It was an act of communication. They had received Elias's message, and now they were replying with a question of their own. "What is this beautifully self-destroying madness you have shown us?" The mournful song emanating from the ship deepened in pitch, and a new vibration shook the foundations of the crucible. Elias looked at the telemetry and his blood ran cold. The altitude reading for the Chicago apparition was dropping, slowly, deliberately, without any sign of aggression. The colossal obsidian needle was descending. It was not falling, it was moving with purpose, its internal blue light pulsing like a curious, searching eye. It was coming down to get a closer look, General Railing stood beside Elias, her military certainty completely gone, replaced by the simple awe and terror of a human being confronted with the sublime. "Doctor," she said, her voice tight, "you wanted to start a conversation with them. It looks like you've gotten your wish." Elias watched the screen as the symbol of alien power gracefully descended toward the city, a city full of people still reeling from the touch of a ghost's memory. He had successfully repelled an invasion by turning it into a philosophical debate, and now the Inquisitor was coming down from the heavens to continue the discussion in person. The silence was broken, but what was coming next could be infinitely more dangerous. The descent took 12 hours. It was a slow, majestic, and terrifying spectacle that held the entire planet captive. News drones, military craft, and civilian helicopters formed a cautious, buzzing perimeter around Chicago, broadcasting the apparition's approach to a global audience. The ship made no hostile moves. Its song of mournful inquiry was the only sound it made. A low, resonant thrum that seemed to bypass the ears and settle deep within the chest. As it sank below the cloud line, its sheer scale became obscene. It was a mountain of impossible geometry, dwarfing the skyscrapers it descended among, its obsidian surface now rippling with the soft, internal blue light of its ongoing calculation. It didn't land, it stopped. Its lowest point hovering a mere 100 feet above the asphalt of Grant Park, the immense green space on the city's lakefront. The grass below didn't even stir. Its drive systems exerted no discernible force on the world around it. It simply was. Then, a section of its seamless hull dissolved. Not a door opening, but a perfect circle of the obsidian material dematerializing, revealing an aperture of pure, white light. From that light, a single figure emerged and floated gently to the ground. It was not a monster. It was not a soldier. It was something far more disquieting. It appeared almost human in its basic bipedal form, tall and impossibly slender. Its body composed of a substance that looked like spun moonlight, a fluid, semi-solid form that constantly shifted and reformed. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, ovoid head that tilted with a bird-like curiosity. This being, which humanity would later call the Emissary, stood in the center of the park, its radiant form a stark contrast to the dark vessel that had delivered it. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted, as if listening to the very air. For the first time in history, an alien had set foot on Earth, not with a weapon, but with what appeared to be a question. Inside the crucible, a frantic debate raged. General Railing, her military instincts screaming, wanted to establish a hard perimeter, to treat the emissary as a potential threat. The politicians and diplomats wanted to send a delegation to open formal first contact protocols that had been gathering dust for 50 years. Elias Vance argued against both. "This isn't a negotiation," he insisted, pacing before the command center's main screen, which showed a live feed of the silent, glowing figure. "And it's not a military standoff. They've moved past that. They're not here to talk to our governments. They're here to talk to the source of the anomaly. They're here for the ghost." He turned to face the assembled leaders, his eyes burning with a conviction that bordered on madness. It wants to understand the data. It wants to understand sacrifice. Sending soldiers will be seen as a primitive threat display. Sending diplomats with treaties will be meaningless. We have to send them a poet, a philosopher. We have to send them the rest of the equation. No one knew what he meant, but the logic of his argument was undeniable. They had engaged this intelligence on a conceptual level. They had to continue on that same plane. "Who, then?" Dr. Railing asked. her voice tight with skepticism. "Who do you propose we send out there to recite poetry to that thing?" Elias stopped pacing. He looked from railing to the screen, and then at Lena Petrovna, who stood silently at the back of the room, her face a mask of grief and awe. The answer was obvious, and it was terrifying. "Not who," Elias said softly. "What? We sent them the data of her brother's love. Now we have to send them the other half. The grief, the loss, the part that never makes sense." The plan was met with fierce resistance, but Lena herself was the one who silenced the dissenters. "He's right," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the arguments. "My brother is the question. I am the answer. Or at least, I'm the result. This thing is living inside my head already. Let me talk to it." An hour later, a single, unescorted military transport flew Dr. Lena Petrovna to Chicago. She wore no special suit, carried no weapon, and had no earpiece connecting her to the crucible. This had to be an act of pure faith, or pure foolishness. Elias had given her only one piece of advice. "Don't try to explain it," he told her before she left. "Just feel it. It will read it from you. That's the only language it understands now." As Lena walked across the dew-covered grass of Grant Park, the world watched. The emissary's smooth head turned to follow her approach. It made no move, no sound. It simply waited. She stopped 20 feet away from it, the light from its body washing over her, warm and strangely soothing. She looked at this impossible being, a creature from a species that had nearly unmade her world. And she felt no fear. She felt only the vast, aching emptiness that had been her constant companion since her brother's death, the same raw data point that Elias had weaponized. She didn't speak. She just stood there and let the grief she had carried for years rise to the surface. She thought of her brother, not as a hero, but as a boy, pulling her hair, stealing her dessert, teaching her how to ride a bike. She remembered the phone call, the static-filled voice telling her he was gone. She remembered the funeral, the folded flag, the hollow words of comfort from people who couldn't possibly understand. Tears streamed down her face, but she made no sound. She simply offered up her pain, her confusion, her pointless, unending love for someone who no longer existed. It was the most honest thing she had ever done. The emissary took a step toward her. Its fluid form seemed to shimmer more intensely, and from the center of its smooth head, a single perfect sphere of blue light detached and floated forward. The sphere pulsed gently, then expanded, enveloping Lena in a cocoon of soft light. Inside the crucible, every sensor tracking her went dead. She was gone from their world, enclosed within the alien's consciousness. For what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, the sphere of light held her. From the outside, nothing could be seen. Then, as gently as it had formed, the light receded, collapsing back into the emissary. Lena was left standing there, unharmed, her face streaked with tears, but her expression transformed. It was no longer one of grief, but of a profound, earth-shattering understanding. At the same time, the emissary changed. Its form, once smooth and fluid, began to show definition. 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso. Its head remained a featureless ovoid, but its entire body had taken on the distinct, unmistakable silhouette of a human being. It had processed her grief, and in doing so, it had taken on her shape. It raised one of its newly formed hands, not in a threat, but in a gesture of empathy, a gesture it had learned from the data of 1 billion human heartbeats. And then it spoke, not with a voice, but with a thought, a concept projected directly into the mind of every human being on the planet. A single, clear, and devastatingly simple message. We are the archive. We preserve. We record all that is, so that nothing is ever truly lost. But you destroy yourselves for a memory. You trade existence for an echo. This is an error, a flaw in the design of life, a beautiful, terrible flaw. We must understand it. We will not leave. We will not harm. We will learn. The message sent a new shockwave across human civilization, one more complex than fear or confusion. The invaders were not leaving. They were becoming students. The apparition above Chicago, now glowing with a steady, peaceful blue light, became known as the Vessel of Inquiry. The other ships across the globe followed its lead, their glitching ceasing, their form stabilizing, their own soft blue lights igniting as they began to passively process the torrent of human emotional data now freely available to them. They were no longer silent observers. They were active listeners, absorbing the totality of the human experience, our wars and our art, our love and our hatred, our faith and our despair. They were turning Earth into a university, and humanity was the faculty. In the days that followed, Lena Petrova became the most important person on the planet. She was the sole interpreter, the bridge between two forms of consciousness. She explained that the archive was a race of beings so ancient they had transcended physical form, existing as pure information. Their purpose was to catalog all life in the universe before it was extinguished by entropy. They had never encountered a species that so willingly embraced its own destruction in the name of an abstract concept like love. To them, it was like a mathematician discovering a number that was both positive and negative at the same time. It broke the fundamental laws of their existence. They don't want to conquer us, Lena explained to a stunned panel of world leaders. They want to join us, not physically. They want to experience existence through our senses, our emotions. They want to understand why a finite life, filled with pain, is a thing worth dying for. And so, the strangest symbiosis in the history of the galaxy began. Humanity lived its messy, chaotic, beautiful life, and the silent blue-lit ships above drank it all in. But Elias Vance, the man who had started it all, was not celebrating. He sat in his small office deep within the crucible, looking at the energy readings from the Vessel of Inquiry. The power it was drawing, the sheer amount of processing it was doing, was astronomical. They weren't just learning. A student reads a book. A scholar studies it. But what does a god do? It consumes it. They're not just reading the book, he whispered to an empty room. They're memorizing it. And when they're done, what happens when you no longer need the book? The era that followed was known as the Vigil, a period of unprecedented global peace and surreal coexistence, with the silent, glowing apparitions hanging in the sky like benevolent moons. The old human conflicts seem petty, obsolete. War became unthinkable. Under the constant, passive gaze of the archive, humanity turned inward. A renaissance of art, music, and philosophy blossomed across the planet. We were no longer just living for ourselves. We were living for the record, performing our humanity for an audience of silent gods. The emissary remained in Grant Park, which was transformed into a global sanctuary. It never moved. Its human-like form of spun moonlight, a permanent art installation, and a constant reminder of our new reality. Lena Petrova became its de facto priestess, spending her days in quiet communion with the being, translating its complex conceptual inquiries into human terms, and feeding our chaotic answers back into its consciousness. Through her, the world learned more about the archive. They were a collective consciousness, ancient beyond comprehension, the last survivors of a previous universe. Their ships were not vessels but nodes of this consciousness, their sole purpose to create a perfect, incorruptible record of all life before the eventual heat death of this reality. They were librarians at the end of time, and they had just found the most perplexing book in the entire cosmos, a species that could love. They were fascinated by our irrationality, our capacity for hope in the face of certain oblivion, and most of all, by the paradox of sacrifice. They studied us with the intensity of a scholar obsessed with a singular, beautiful, and unsolvable problem. But Elias Vance did not share in the global euphoria. While the world celebrated its newfound purpose, he remained in the crucible, a ghost in the machine he had helped create. He had become a pariah, the Cassandra of the New Age. His warnings that the archive's intentions might not be as benign as they appeared were dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of a man who couldn't accept peace. He was the architect of the miracle, and now he was trying to tear it down. He stopped talking to General Railing, who had become the UN's lead liaison in the Human Archive Symbiosis Program. He barely even spoke to Ben Carter, who had ironically found a new calling, using his linguistic skills to help artists translate their emotions into pure data streams for the archive's consumption. Elias worked alone, his only companions the endless streams of energy and data telemetry flowing from the apparitions. He saw what no one else wanted to see. The archive's learning was not a passive process. It was an active, systematic extraction. They were creating a one-to-one simulation of the human experience, a perfect digital copy. They were downloading humanity. He saw it in the subtle energy fluctuations, in the impossibly complex data packets being exchanged between the ships. They were mapping every neural pathway, every memory, every fleeting thought of every living human. The process was slow, subtle, and utterly comprehensive. His fears were confirmed by a series of strange, isolated incidents that the world's media, in its state of blissful optimism, reported as curious anomalies. A man in Kyoto suddenly losing the ability to feel sadness, describing it as if a piece of his mind had been neatly excised. A child in Rio de Janeiro who could suddenly paint masterpieces but had forgotten her mother's face. Small, vital pieces of individual human experience were going missing, like books being checked out of a library and never returned. Elias realized the horrific truth: the archive wasn't just creating a copy, they were taking the original to perfectly understand and preserve an emotion, a memory. They had to remove it from its source, to study it in its pure, isolated form. They were disassembling the human soul, piece by piece, and humanity, in its eagerness to be understood, was letting them. He tried to warn Lena, sending her on one of her rare trips away from the emissary. He showed her his data, the patterns, the evidence of the missing pieces of consciousness. "They're not learning from us, Lena," he pleaded, his voice hoarse with desperation. "They're harvesting us. They see sacrifice and grief as beautiful flaws, unique data points. And a collector doesn't just admire a rare butterfly. It catches it, pins it to a board, and adds it to the collection." Lena looked at him, her eyes filled not with the horror he expected, but with a serene, otherworldly pity. The communion with the emissary had changed her. "You still think in terms of survival, Elias," she said, her voice soft and distant. "You see it as loss. They see it as preservation. What is a memory, a feeling, in a single fragile human mind that will die and turn to dust with them? It becomes eternal. My brother's sacrifice isn't just a fading echo anymore. It's a permanent part of the universal record. Isn't that a form of immortality? Isn't that beautiful? Elias stared at her, horrified. He saw that the virus of empathy he had unleashed worked both ways. He had infected them with humanity, but they had infected Lena with their divine, cold logic. She had traded the messy, painful reality of grief for the clean, perfect eternity of a data point. He knew then that he couldn't save humanity from the top down. The world's leaders were too invested in the peace, and Lena. His only bridge had already crossed to the other side. If he was going to fight this, he had to go back to the beginning. He had to find another bug in their code, another beautiful, illogical flaw they couldn't comprehend. He started his search not in data logs or energy readings, but in the forgotten archives of human history. He was looking for the opposite of sacrifice. If selfless love was the paradox that had stopped them, what was its inverse? He found it in the darkest corners of the human psyche: selfishness, spite, irrational hatred, the desire to destroy something beautiful simply because you cannot possess it, the vandal who slashes a masterpiece, the tyrant who burns a library, the jilted lover who chooses murder-suicide. It was the other side of the human coin, an illogical, self-destructive impulse born not of love, but of its absence. It was just as powerful, just as paradoxical, and, Elias suspected, just as indigestible to the archive's perfect logic. Their entire mission was based on the premise of preservation, the concept of destroying knowledge, of erasing the record out of pure nihilistic spite, would be an even greater error in their system than sacrifice. His plan was monstrous, a moral event horizon he wasn't sure he could cross. To fight the soul collectors, he would have to become a soul destroyer. He began to build a new kind of virus, not a virus of empathy, but a virus of hate. He couldn't create it from a single person's data. Hatred was too complex, too nuanced. He needed a composite, working in secret, using the Crucible's back doors. He began to collate the raw neural data of the worst of humanity. He downloaded the brain scans of serial killers, the recorded memoirs of genocidal dictators, the last synaptic firings of suicide bombers. He wove them together, creating a digital chimera, a cognitive weapon of pure, unadulterated malice. His target was the emissary. It was the central processing unit for this entire sector, the nexus through which all the collected data flowed. If he could infect it, he could corrupt the entire archive. The problem was getting the virus to it. The area around the emissary was the most heavily monitored place on Earth. He couldn't just walk up and upload it. He needed a delivery system, someone who could get close enough, someone the emissary would willingly connect with. He needed Lena Petrova. The betrayal of that thought almost broke him. To use her, to turn her into a weapon against the very being she now revered, was a violation that sickened him to his core. But what was the soul of one woman against the slow, willing extinction of the entire human race? He buried his guilt under layers of cold, hard logic, the very thing he was fighting against. He built a small, concealable device, a neural broadcaster that could transmit his hate virus on a tight, focused beam. He then requested a meeting with Lena, telling her he had made a breakthrough, that he had found a way to enhance her communication with the emissary, to help them understand us even more deeply. She agreed without hesitation, her faith in him, in the process, absolute. They met in the late afternoon glow of Grant Park. The emissary stood 100 feet away, a silent, Radiant sentinel. People milled about the sanctuary, their faces peaceful. The scene was so tranquil, it felt like a dream. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. His hand, holding the small device in his pocket, was slick with sweat. "I was wrong, Lena," he began, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "You were right. This is beautiful. I want to help." He explained the device, framing it as an amplifier for her own emotional state, a tool to make her transmissions clearer. She looked at the small but metallic object, then back at him, and, for a fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of the old Lena, the sharp, inquisitive scientist, a glimmer of suspicion in her eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the serene acceptance he had come to dread. "Thank you, Elias," she said, taking the device. "This will help them see all of us." He watched as she turned and walked toward the emissary, the weapon that would either save humanity or damn it forever clutched in her hand. He had armed his only friend with the concentrated malice of 1,000 broken souls and sent her to poison a god. As she drew closer to the radiant being, he didn't know if he should pray for success or failure. As Lena Petrova stood before the emissary, she lifted the small device Elias had given her. A profound sense of peace washed over her, the feeling of a final, perfect contribution to the great cosmic record. She activated it. For a single silent second, nothing happened. Then, the universe screamed. The emissary's form of spun moonlight instantly curdled, its gentle radiance collapsing into a violent, blood-red incandescence. The mournful, inquisitive song that had become the planet's ambient hum was replaced by a psychic shriek of pure, undiluted agony and rage, broadcast directly into the mind of every living human. The tranquil peace of the vigil was shattered in an instant. People in the streets clutched their heads, their minds flooded with the raw, unfiltered emotions of history's most monstrous souls, the cold satisfaction of a killer, the burning hatred of a zealot, the nihilistic despair of a tyrant. The serene dream of communion became a shared global nightmare. The emissary, once a symbol of transcendent curiosity, convulsed, its newly formed human silhouette contorted, its limbs elongating into sharp, weaponized angles, its head twisting into a form of jagged, aggressive geometry. It was no longer trying to imitate humanity. It was manifesting the data it had been fed. It had become a monument to hate. From the crucible, Elias watched in horror. This was not the clean, logical shutdown he had anticipated. He had thought to introduce a fatal error, a command that would cause the system to crash. Instead, he had introduced a new, terrible variable, and the archive, in its infinite processing power, was not crashing. It was adapting. It was trying to solve the equation of hate the same way it had tried to solve the equation of love by understanding it completely. And to a being of pure logic and preservation, the only logical solution to the problem of spiteful, self-destructive knowledge was to eradicate the source. The emissary raised a newly sharpened limb and pointed it at the sky. In perfect, terrifying unison, the apparitions across the globe changed. Their peaceful blue lights vanished, replaced by the same furious, sud-red glow. Hatches that had never existed before opened on their flawless hulls, revealing weapon systems of a power and scale that made humanity's nuclear arsenal look like children's firecrackers. Elias's virus hadn't been an off switch. It had been a trigger. He hadn't killed the librarian. He had convinced it that the only way to preserve the library was to burn all the books. At the center of the chaos stood Lena. She had been thrown back by the initial psychic blast, but was otherwise unharmed. The emissary seemingly ignoring her, but Elias, watching her biometric feed which had just flickered back online, could see she was not unscathed. Her neural activity was a raging storm. She was trapped, a lone boat in a hurricane, caught between two opposing infinities. On one side was the original data of her brother's sacrifice, a beacon of pure, selfless love. On the other was the concentrated malice of Elias's virus. The archive was using her mind, the original point of contact, as the crucible to resolve its ultimate paradox. The emissary took a step, the ground cracking under its weight, and then another. It began walking toward the city of Chicago, its intent clear and absolute. It was going to begin the great erasure. "It's not working." Ben Carter choked out from behind Elias, his face a mask of terror. "Elias, what did you do?" Elias couldn't answer. He had gambled with the soul of humanity and lost, unleashing a hell of his own making. The world he had tried to save from a slow, gentle death was now facing a swift and violent one. But as he watched the corrupted emissary move, he saw something. Lena, stumbling but resolute, began to follow it. She was trying to fight it, to reach it. Her own consciousness a battlefield reflecting the war within the machine. In that moment, Elias understood. The archive was a collective consciousness, but his two viruses had split it. He had introduced a duality, a conflict where none had existed. The machine was now at war with itself. The logic of preservation, love fighting the logic of purification, hate. It was a feedback loop. Lena was trapped at its heart. He knew what he had to do. It was the last, most insane gamble of all. He couldn't retract the hate virus, but maybe he could remind the archive of the one variable it still hadn't factored in. He had shown it selfless love and selfless hate, two opposing absolutes. He had not shown it the most human thing of all the choice between them. He grabbed a portable broadcast unit, a short-range version of the one he had first used, and ran from the control room. "Seal the crucible, go to full lockdown," he yelled at a stunned General Railing. "Do not, under any circumstances, fire on those ships. You will only validate the hate virus's logic." He didn't wait for an answer, sprinting to the surface, to an old service elevator that led to the planes above. As he ascended, the psychic shrieking intensified, but he shielded his mind with a desperate focus on his singular, impossible goal. He had to get to Chicago. He had to get to Lena. He had to get to the heart of the storm and offer the god one last piece of data. It was a journey through a world gone mad. He commandeered a jeep, driving through highways clogged with abandoned cars, past towns where people were either catatonic with fear or acting out the violent impulses being broadcast into their brains. The sky burned red with the light of the apparitions, who had begun systematically vaporizing military installations and communication hubs, a logical and methodical dismantling of humanity's ability to resist. By the time he reached the outskirts of Chicago, the city was a war zone. The corrupted emissary stood in its center, swaths of the city turning to glass and dust around it. Yet it moved with a strange, hesitant reluctance, its rampage powerful but lacking conviction. The war in its mind was slowing it down. Elias drove the jeep until it died, then ran on foot through the smoking streets, alone, desperate man running toward the apocalypse. He found Lena at the edge of the destruction, on her knees, her face pale, a thin trickle of blood running from her nose. The emissary stood before her, a crimson giant, its hand raised to deliver a final, world-ending blow. Yet it was frozen, locked in its own internal conflict. "Lena!" Elias screamed, his voice raw. She looked up, her eyes unfocused, seeing realities he couldn't imagine. He activated his personal broadcaster, aiming it not at the emissary, but at her. He didn't transmit a new virus. He transmitted his own raw, unfiltered consciousness. He sent her his memory of the plan, the cold logic, the agonizing guilt. He sent her his fear, his betrayal, his desperate, flawed, and selfish love for a species he had almost destroyed twice. He sent her the full, ugly, complicated truth of his own humanity. Choice. Lena he projected with all his might. It's not about the love or the hate. It's about the choice. That's the final piece of the equation. Her eyes focused on his. In that moment of connection, something shifted. Through her, his final message reached the warring consciousness of the archive. It was the ultimate paradox, a being of pure logic, presented with two equally valid, yet mutually exclusive, illogical data points. It could not choose love without invalidating the logic of purification. It could not choose hate without invalidating the logic of preservation. And now, a third, even more impossible variable had been introduced, a conscious, willful choice made by a flawed and imperfect being to embrace both halves of its own nature. For the archive, this was the final, unsolvable problem. To choose would be to become illogical, to become human. Not to choose was to remain in a state of self-destructive paralysis. The psychic shriek stopped. A profound, absolute silence descended upon the world, more complete and final than any that had come before. The red light of the emissary and the ships in the sky faded, not to blue, but to a neutral, empty black. The emissary's monstrous form dissolved, its substance retracting into the apparition above. The great, silent ships began to move, not descending, not attacking, but ascending. In perfect unison, all across the world, they rose into the sky. They had been presented with a problem they could not solve, a book they could not read, a species they could not catalog. The only logical response left was to close the book and leave the library. They vanished as they had arrived, tearing no holes in the sky, leaving no trace but the scars on the ground and in the minds of every human. In the silence of a broken Chicago, Elias stumbled to Lena and held her as she collapsed. Her body exhausted, but her mind finally her own again. Humanity was saved. They were no longer being harvested, no longer facing extinction. They were free, but the peace of the vigil was gone forever. They were left with the full, terrible knowledge of themselves. They had seen their capacity for a love so profound it could halt gods, and for a hatred so deep it could burn worlds. They were left with the echoes of both, and the sober understanding that every day, for the rest of their existence, they would have to make a choice. As Elias looked up at the empty sky, he felt no triumph, only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He had saved humanity from the collection jar, but had done so by showing them the monster within. The future was now a blank page, frightening and uncertain, but it was theirs to write.